This video is going to consider constructionist theory as it relates to the environment. And we'll begin our discussion by citing one of the most important ideas in the field of sociology, often referred to as the Thomas Theorem, which essentially says that how we define things as real will be real in its consequences. And people once believed the earth was flat, and as a result, they were very reluctant to get into boats and sail off towards the horizon. So it's just an example of how we can define reality in such a way that will limit or alter our behavior. And so we're going to apply that to our understanding of the environment and of nature. And so we'll think about the ways that we define these terms. And we'll think about where our definitions come from in terms of our cultural ideologies. And then we'll also think about how those will shape our behavior. And so what's unique about environmental problems as opposed to other social problems is that they will act on us regardless of our understanding or definition. That is, they tend to have this quality of transcending human subjectivity. But that does not negate or minimize the need to think about social definitions. And when it comes to the social movement of the environment, some of the largest challenges that it faces are overcoming false claims about nature and the environment, and there are plenty of those, including those who deny the existence of problems that clearly do exist. Two is overcoming ideologies of domination, these notions of the environment as raw resources, as not having any other internal worth. Three is promoting ideologies of concern, where we tend to play up the value of the environment regardless of economic valuation. And four, creating pro-environmental social norms is another goal of the environmental movement, and that is, if you read the Thomas Eberlein book, one of the key things that he focuses on. So when we think about the word nature, we can point out that yes, human beings are made of nature. It's something that we can't really escape. Our bodies are part of nature. We interact with nature in a number of ways physiologically. So nature is something that makes us, but we don't often think about how we make nature, and that by that we mean how we define it, how we imagine it, and in turn how we react and behave towards it. And so how we see nature is going to depend on our perspective, and our perspective is going to change across time and place, and it's going to change through history and across cultures. Simultaneously, nature is, of course, a dynamic system that is also always changing, and sometimes there's kind of a co-evolution of thought about nature and nature itself. The key thing here is to think about, as Bell and Ashwood point out, the notions of social selection and social reflection. Those things that we notice in nature are to a large degree a product of our culture, our upbringing, our socialization, and the things that we reflect upon similarly reflect our culture and those things that we value and have concern about. So we often notice things that, in Western cultures, exotic species, pristine landscapes, a number of things that people really value and think of and associate with nature. But it's important to point out even those imaginations, as harmless, as more benign as they may seem, are still part of a social and political construct. So there's two competing philosophies we need to think about here. The first is what we would call moral holism, which is akin to this notion of ecocentrism. And it's a realization or an understanding that people are simply a part of nature, that we're not separate and independent of nature, and in fact nature has sort of an exalted place that is superior to just the simple place of humans. And so Jedediah Purdy, who wrote a book called After Nature, points to a couple of environmental imaginations that revolve around this philosophy, and those are romanticism and ecology. On the other side of the coin are what we would call moral separatism, or the anthropocentric view, which places humans at the center of the world, as largely an understanding of people as separate from nature. The notion that nature is something else, something different from us, and consequently the value of nature is derived from what it can provide for us, not what we can provide for it. So the problem here is, of course, ignoring our interdependence with nature, and that, of course, is part of the reason why we got in such a bad mess to begin with environmentally. And Purdy, discussing the environmental imaginations, would claim that the providential and the utilitarian imaginations are related to this particular philosophical standpoint. So, another important concept as we're thinking about definitions is wilderness, because when people think of nature, they often think of wilderness, which is land set aside from deliberate human interference. And it's important to note that even those places we define as wild are often wild because of human action. The act of passing a law, of protecting a particular place, is all a social product, and without that, the wilderness area may cease to exist. So even these pristine environmental places that we think are free from human presence exist, ironically, because of human action. So, wilderness as an expression of moral holism is an interesting thing. It does not universally and imperialistically promote a no-people vision of wilderness. In fact, many deep parts of Africa, South America, Asia contain cultures and people who have lived in a hunting and gathering arrangement, living with nature for centuries and continue to do so. And it would be odd to say that they are spoiling nature, they're not part of nature, they are disrupting nature, something like that. And so this notion that people cannot be a part of the wilderness scene is really a Western construct. So ultimately, this notion of wilderness, at the end of the day, is a state of mind as much as a state of nature. So a debate has emerged among scholars, those who might be called Constructionists, what we're considering now, and those who might be called Realists, those we've reviewed in other places. The Constructionists are more concerned about how we define things and how our definitions shape our actions, while Realists are less concerned with definition and more concerned with the real causes of our problems. And so we had a healthy debate that was ultimately resolved through a middle ground position, I think. This notion of critical realism might be that. That's a notion that we need to pay attention to definitions. We also need to be aware that many environmental problems operate behind our backs, so to speak, independent of our subjective understanding. So it's not really an either-or type of thing. We have to be paying attention to both sides of the debate. Of course, an important part in all this is to consider the role of evidence, and when it comes to establishing the existence through definition of an environmental problem, evidence plays an important role. And of course, evidence is part of the material world. So for us to say that such and such is a problem, we need to have some kind of basis in the real world. The problem is, culturally, as Manju points out, we could be moving to what's called a post-fact society, or the view that all opinions are equal, that there really is no such thing as evidence. There's evidence on both sides of every debate. These kind of beliefs really tend to undermine any kind of productive movement towards supporting one idea over another, of course. And that's a problem, because there are real problems with lots of evidence that don't have a corollary opposite side of the coin with equal amount of evidence. I think that's the key point. So the other problem, of course, is the manufacture of doubt. The notion that there's actually intentional action going on, usually on the part of special interests who wish to delude and lie to us and maybe call into question things that have a great deal of evidence. And that was, of course, the case with the tobacco industry. A great deal of evidence was pointing to health problems, and the industry invested substantial resources to fight that claim in order to keep their products relevant and problem-free. And of course, eventually that was resolved with labeling and sort of the, of course, establishment of fact that smoking is bad for your health. It's not just tobacco. We can look at the climate change debate in a similar light. There's a great deal of evidence to support the notion that climate change is taking place and that it is caused by humans. We have ice core samples. We have other ways of observing these types of things over time. And about 97% of scientists agree that we have a problem with climate change. And yet, oftentimes in the media, this is portrayed as something that's up an open debate. It's up in the air. That maybe it's a 50-50 coin toss. But when 3% of scientists believe something and 97% of scientists believe the other, it doesn't really take a whole lot of math to realize which way the wind blows, so to speak. So that's interesting. This phenomenon of fighting claims that establish a problem. So in conclusion, when we think about the constructionist approach to the environment, constructionist theory in general, we can note it's difficult to solve a problem when people refuse to acknowledge it exists through definition. And, that's one of the major, I guess, barricades to making progress on climate change is we haven't gotten past the definitional stage. Number two, all the evidence in the world, such as that collected by the International Panel on Climate Change, never seems to be enough. And in fact, sadly, there's research that shows when presented with evidence to the contrary to what people believe, they often simply become more entrenched and more solidified in their initial beliefs rather than being swayed by the evidence. So this kind of anti-scientific cultural standpoint is itself a problem. So the key question is, how can we stop the manufacture of doubt and the denial of problems that have a strong evidentiary and factual basis? Right? These are the kind of things we're going to have to think about. And if you'd like some good resources to examine, you can look at the John Oliver clip on the climate change debate. You can check out a documentary called The Merchants of Doubt, or you can watch the movie The Matrix, all of which deal with this idea of socially constructing and defining reality and how that can be so profound in shaping our behavior. And that's going to do it. Thanks for watching.